The first time I heard the sound, I didn't recognize it as my own salvation. It was a tiny click under the linen, a fingertip finding a button the size of a lintel, while crystal chimed all around us. Candles threw soft halos across the Whitmans' dining room in Winnetka, and Drew lifted his glass like he was blessing the whole lakefront. Naomi laughed at something only he could hear. Her hand hovering too close to his sleeve, and the room swelled with a warmth that did not touch me. My pulse slowed instead of raced each beat, measuring the distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. That click wasn't loud, not to anyone else, but to me. It cut through the silver and stemware, like a clean seam in silk, the exact moment a mask begins to split. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if stories of truth and justice help you sleep a little easier, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Elise, and I grew up in a house where people kept their promises. My mother taught reading at the elementary school. My dad fixed neighbors' cars on Saturdays and never took a dime he didn't earn. I became a school counselor because I believe in quiet rescues, the kind where a kid finds words for something he's carried too long, and you watch his shoulders lower when the truth fits. Drew's world dazzled me because it was everything mine wasn't: rooftop benefits tuxedos with monogrammed studs, weekends on a boat that had a name, and conversations that spoke fluent profit. He courted me with the humility of a man born to money and practiced at making it seem like an accident, and I told myself that sincerity could live comfortably beside a trust fund if you watered it enough. When we married at a limestone church off Michigan Avenue, I thought I'd found a life where effort and elegance could hold hands without either one losing its grip. Naomi came with the package of my adulthood long before Drew did. Freshman year roommate turned bridesmaid, turned godmother to my niece. The kind of friend who knew which hospital snack machines still took quarters and which dressed alone when a zipper quit. She was the bright piece in every room, the one who could tease a story into laughter and have the donors laughing with her before the salads arrived. Our lives ran side by side without trampling each other, and for years that felt like proof of something unbreakable. When she and Drew hit it off over a fundraiser seating chart, I thought the universe was finally showing its gentle hand. I saw their ease as a blessing, not a warning, because good women don't tally smiles between the two people they love most. The Whitman family itself ran on choreography. Evelyn's perfect table, Richard's measured toasts about grit, Drew's practiced nods at the right names and numbers. I learned the steps quickly: how to ask about a project without sounding like I expected an answer, how to listen to talk about square footage like it was a new baby. On Sundays, I packed casseroles for my school families and then slipped into dresses the color of champagne bubbles. By Monday, I was back in a circle of 7th graders explaining how feelings aren't emergencies. That balance felt noble for a long time, as if I were bridging 2 Chicagos with a steady foot on each shore. If there were small things, the gentle corrections when I mispronounced a client's last name, Naomi's jokes about my teacher voice when I asked for details, I filed them under differences, not danger. People ask when the shift begins, and I think it starts so softly you can mistake it for a draft. A phone turned face down at dinner, because the glare is distracting a new cologne that smells like the first night of winter. A laugh caught between 2 people at a gala that leaves you a step outside the circle. Drew started staying late for investor prep, the kind of phrase that fills an entire evening without saying much at all, and Naomi began canceling our Thursday wine with sighs about crisis communications. I told myself this is what success does in its busy season. It runs hot and expects understanding like an appetizer. My mother's voice in my head said, "Marriage meets people where they are," and I decided to be the one who met first, because kindness had never cost me more than time. When we moved to a glass-lined condo near the lake, the view looked like a promise you could frame: water that changed its mood with the weather, and a skyline that kept its own secrets. I filled it with the kind of details that make a place belong to 2 people. Family photos along the hallway, a bowl for our keys on the console, notes on the fridge about whose turn it was to buy coffee. Naomi called it grown-up pretty and asked if she could steal my paint color, and it felt like a compliment that landed in the right place. On Saturdays, Drew made pancakes, like a man performing a part he loved, whistling off-key while the griddle hissed, and I believed that ordinary joy might be the truest kind. If there was a thin line of distance tracing itself through our days, I chalked it up to pace, not to purpose. I should have trusted the way silence began to change its weight in our home. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant, like a room holding its breath before the door opens. The small things grew hands, a perfume that didn't belong to me. A text that arrived too late to be work and too early to be kind. A joke that brushed my edges a shade too hard. When I finally asked a careful question, Drew smiled like a man who had already prepared the right answer, and Naomi smoothed the moment with a kindness that made me feel childish for asking. That's how you learn the difference between reassurance and redirection. The first leaves you steadier, the second leaves you quiet. By the time winter settled over the lake, I had learned to fold my questions until they fit in a pocket. I didn't know then that the click I would one day hear under the linen had already begun to echo in me, faint as a metronome. You sense more than hear. I didn't know yet that the night air outside the Whitman house could carry the truth like a cold scent you can't ignore. I only knew our life looked radiant from the street, and I had been taught to honor what shines. The first real crack would come fast, the way thin ice gives all at once, and when it did, it would change the shape of every sound in that house. But before the glass breaks, you learn the room by heart. The shift started so quietly, I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. It was in the way Drew left his phone face down at dinner screen dark, a hand resting casually over it as though he had nothing to hide. He would say a client needed late calls, or an investor kept unusual hours explanations. I tried to believe because marriage is built on trust, but belief is hard to hold when the perfume on his shirt is not yours, when the laughter echoing from his study belongs to another woman. Little details became shadows stretching across our home, and no matter how tightly I pulled the curtains, they seeped through. Naomi's changes came dressed as coincidence. She began bowing out of our Thursday nights with vague excuses about overwork, her voice bright, but her eyes too quick when we did manage to meet. The woman who once never missed a glass of wine or a long talk on my sofa suddenly had emergencies that stacked one atop the other. When she arrived late to gatherings breathless and glowing, I tried to remind myself she thrived on attention and busy schedules. Still, I caught the pause before she answered questions, the practiced ease that felt more like rehearsal than truth. I brushed those feelings aside, thinking old friends deserved the benefit of the doubt, not suspicion. There was one evening at a gala when my unease bloomed into something heavier. Drew had been attentive that night, guiding me through the room, introducing me to investors with a smile that made me believe for a few hours we were still the couple who belonged together. Then, Naomi appeared in a crimson dress, her arrival turning heads. I watched his eyes follow her a moment too long, a spark that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared, but not quickly enough to erase what I had seen. Later, I asked about it, and Drew kissed my forehead with that practiced gentleness and said I was imagining things. Naomi added her soft agreement, telling me not to overthink, and between them, they smoothed my doubts into silence. At family dinners in Winnetka, the Whitmans carried on as though nothing beneath their polished world could ever be questioned. Richard spoke proudly of Drew's judgment in business, his voice heavy with certainty. Evelyn praised Naomi's loyalty, telling me how grateful she was that I had such a steadfast friend. Their words slid across me like ice, leaving me chilled but unable to speak. I sat at that long mahogany table, smiling in all the right places, while inside, I felt the edges of myself wearing thin. Even Claire, my sister-in-law, with her sharp eyes, looked at me with the kind of sympathy that suggested she thought I was simply stressed, nothing more. The role of fragile wife was being assigned to me, and I was expected to play it. The word that began to cling to me was crazy. Drew used it when I questioned why he was late again. Naomi used it when I confided my worries, shaking her head and insisting I was letting imagination run wild. Even his family, loyal to appearances, echoed it in smaller ways, urging me to relax, to stop worrying, to take care of myself. I heard it enough that it began to sound like a diagnosis, not a judgment. And the more they said it, the more isolated I became, trapped inside a box of doubt they built for me. When people you love tell you the same story often enough, you start to believe it, even if it's the story of your own unraveling. I tried to remind myself of the moments that felt solid. The mornings when Drew made pancakes and hummed the afternoons when Naomi helped me choose fabrics for a room I was redesigning. I clung to those pieces like lifelines, telling myself they proved the foundation of my life was still steady. But even those memories began to sour. I would remember Naomi braiding my hair on my wedding day, and hear in my mind her later whisper to Drew at the gala. I would picture Drew holding me after my miscarriage, promising we would try again, and feel the sting of perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. The very moments meant to anchor me became evidence of betrayal, replaying in sharper and sharper detail. One night, Drew came home late, his tie loosened and his face drawn. I teased him lightly about working too hard, trying to draw us back to the easy rhythm we once had. He snapped instead, asking why I always had to question him, his voice sharp enough to leave a mark. He apologized quickly, pouring himself a drink, as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the way my chest tightened in that moment. The next day, Naomi asked, with practiced concern, if everything was all right, tilting her head and smiling as though she already knew the answer. When I brushed it off, she reassured me that I was probably just overthinking again. That word, overthinking, pressed against me like a hand, guiding me back into silence. The holidays brought their own theater. The family mansion glittered with lights, ornaments catching fire from the chandeliers. I watched Naomi enter late, her dress gleaming as she crossed the room. Drew leaned down to whisper in her ear, and she laughed, her hand brushing his sleeve like it belonged there. It was a tiny moment in a crowded room, gone almost instantly, but it burned behind my ribs the rest of the night. Later, when I asked him about it, his dismissal was quick and certain. I was imagining things again, and Naomi agreed, her sympathy so smooth it felt rehearsed. They handed me a script I hadn't agreed to, and still I found myself reciting the lines. That winter, the weight of doubt became nearly unbearable. I would wake in the night and listen to Drew's even breathing, wondering where he had been, wondering if Naomi's sudden fatigue on Friday nights was real, or something she invented to cover her tracks. Every excuse felt like a brick stacked against me, walling me into a corner I couldn't find my way out of. My own friends, people outside their circle, told me I needed rest, that stress was playing tricks on me. The story had spread farther than I realized, carried on in whispers and sidelong glances. I was no longer simply Elise the counselor, the wife, the friend. I was Elise who worried too much, Elise who couldn't tell truth from fear, Elise who sounded a little unsteady. But beneath the exhaustion and the self-doubt, something colder began to take root. I started listening harder, not to their words, but to the pauses between them, the slips they thought I missed. Naomi once stumbled, saying when Drew and when we before catching herself. My smile covered the jolt in my chest, but I filed the moment away. Another time, Drew left his phone unlocked on the counter just long enough for me to see Naomi's name at the top of a message thread before he picked it up again. I said nothing, but the image stayed with me. I was learning to gather these pieces quietly, even before I fully admitted to myself what they meant. I knew then that the cracks were no longer just in my imagination. They were real, spreading through every part of my life, reshaping the world I thought I knew. And though I still hadn't spoken the truth aloud, The silence was starting to feel different. It was no longer submission. It was waiting. I couldn't yet see how close I stood to the moment when doubt would become certainty. But the ground was already shifting under me. The next sign would not come as a whisper or a hint. It would come as a shatter, loud and undeniable. And once it broke, nothing would ever be the same again. The night I found the truth didn't arrive with fireworks. It crept in like a draft through a crack in the window, the kind you ignore until it chills you bone deep. Drew had said he was at the office again, caught up in meetings that stretched into the evening. I poured myself a glass of wine, settled on the sofa with half-finished case notes for my students, and tried to ignore the hollow silence pressing against the walls. When the quiet became too heavy, I reached for his tablet, the one he kept tucked in the drawer beside his desk. He thought I never touched it. He thought wrong. I expected to find nothing more than emails, maybe a calendar invite or two, the kind of mundane proof that would make me feel guilty for doubting him. Instead, I found messages he hadn't deleted from his backup threads that glowed against the screen like embers waiting to set everything ablaze. His words to Naomi leapt out first. "I can't stop thinking about last night." Her reply, "You'll have to. People are starting to notice." And then Drew's answer, the one that hollowed me out completely. "Let them. She'll never believe it." My breath caught, my hand frozen against the glass of the screen, as Naomi's next message appeared like a knife sliding into place. "She already suspects. You're too careless." His response sealed it. "Doesn't matter. I've convinced her she's losing it." I dropped the tablet onto the couch as though it had burned me, the glow of the screen casting light on hands that wouldn't stop trembling. My mind flooded with memories, each one rewritten in an instant. Naomi braiding my hair on my wedding day, whispering she'd always protect me. Drew holding me at the hospital, swearing we'd try again. Every vow, every shared laugh, every look I thought held love and loyalty collapsed under the weight of those words. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a conspiracy designed to erase me from my own life. The grief came in waves that knocked me off my feet. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass across the room, to tear apart the polished space we had built together. Instead, I sank onto the rug, my knees pulling tight to my chest, rocking as if motion could stop the spinning. Hours blurred. My wine went untouched, the city lights outside smearing against the window. When my phone buzzed, I jumped only to see Naomi's name flash across the screen. Her message landed like an insult. "Thinking of you tonight. Love you, sis." The word sis mocked me, glowing in letters I could barely read through the blur of my vision. I laughed, then a sound so sharp and broken it startled me. A laugh that didn't belong to the woman I used to be. In the days that followed, I moved through the world like a ghost. Food turned to ash in my mouth. Sleep slipped from me, leaving only hollow hours where anger and disbelief traded places in my chest. Drew kissed my cheek in the mornings with the ease of a man who believed his lies had settled, and Naomi called with her practiced concern, asking if I was managing okay. Their cruelty lived in every syllable disguised as care. I stopped answering more than I had to, letting silence stand in my place. It was easier to be quiet than to risk my voice breaking in half. One night, Drew came home later than usual, his tie crooked, his phone clutched in his hand. I asked him directly if he had been with her, my voice low and steady, despite the shaking in my body. He looked at me with the practiced pity of a man who had rehearsed the lines. "Elise, do you hear yourself? You're not well. Even Naomi is worried. Why do you insist on destroying yourself like this?" His words echoed long after he went to bed, rolling through me like thunder across an empty field. For hours, I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at the skyline, as the city blurred into streaks of white and gold. And then something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't the one destroying myself. I was being erased. Piece by piece, they were writing me out of my own life. That night, grief began to turn into something sharper. I decided I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. If they wanted me to look like the fragile, paranoid wife, then I would let them believe it. I would nod when they dismissed me, smile when they tried to comfort me, and let them think they had won. Behind that mask, I would gather my weapons quietly. Their arrogance had already left cracks. I only had to widen them. The days that followed became an act I performed with precision. At family dinners, I smiled at the right times, accepted Evelyn's compliments on Naomi's loyalty with a grateful nod, and let Richard praise Drew's integrity without a flicker of protest. Behind the curtain, I replayed every message in my mind, every phrase Naomi had whispered into my ear while conspiring against me. I began to see clearly the theater they had staged, and I was done playing the fool. Shock had given way to clarity, and clarity was becoming resolve. I told myself over and over that revenge would not come from shouting or sudden rage. Revenge would come from patience, from silence sharpened into steel. If they thought I was unraveling, they were wrong. I was knitting something together in the dark, stitch by stitch, a design only I could see. And when the time came, I wouldn't simply expose them. I would dismantle them, using their own words as the rope. It was still early, still just the beginning of the transformation, but I felt the shift each time I looked in the mirror. My face was the same, but my eyes carried something unfamiliar. The woman they called crazy was gone. The woman staring back was someone they had not prepared for, and as I brushed my hair back and slipped under the covers that night, I whispered to the silence, "You think you've won. You think I'm broken. But you've already lost. You just don't know it yet." What I didn't realize then was that my resolve was only the first step. Soon, I would learn how much power lived in proof, in the small details they thought too trivial to hide. And with every detail I gathered, the balance between us would begin to tilt. The Sunday dinner that marked my turning point looked from the outside like any other gathering at the Whitman home. Richard carved the roast with steady hands, Evelyn floated between conversations, and laughter swirled around the polished table. Drew sat at the head, basking in his father's approval, while Naomi leaned close, her voice warm and familiar as she filled Evelyn's ear with compliments. I kept my posture straight, my smile gentle, but inside, I was watching every detail, the way his hand lingered too long near hers, the way her eyes caught mine with a flicker that felt like victory. They thought I was fading into the background. But in that moment, I saw the whole picture for what it was. They were actors, and I had been cast as their fool. When Richard praised Drew's integrity in business, I felt the words scrape across me like sandpaper. Evelyn clasped Naomi's hand, calling her a blessing in my life, and the bitterness rose in my throat like smoke. They didn't know the details, but they believed the performance because believing was easier than questioning. I sat silent while the story played around me, but my silence felt different that night. It wasn't the quiet of defeat, it was the stillness before a storm gathers. As Drew leaned toward Naomi with a whisper that made her cheeks flush, I knew with chilling clarity that I would not let this play continue without rewriting the ending. When we left, Drew guided me with a hand at the small of my back, a gesture he had used for years to remind me of my place. That touch, once tender, now felt like ownership, like control. I walked beside him, but inside, something had hardened. By the time we reached the car, the ache I had carried for weeks had crystallized into intent. I didn't feel shattered anymore. I felt sharpened. That night, I sat at my vanity long after he fell asleep, staring at my reflection under the dim light. The woman looking back at me was the same in shape, but not in spirit. My chestnut hair framed the same brown eyes, but those eyes no longer carried only pain. They held resolve. I leaned close to the mirror and whispered, "You think I'm crazy? Then let me show you what crazy can do." The next morning, I moved through the house with a calmness that startled even me. Drew scrolled his phone at the kitchen island, sipping coffee as if the night before hadn't happened. I studied him across the room, noting how he didn't look up when I entered, how his watch gleamed in the sunlight, his wedding band catching the light like a lie. He spoke casually about his schedule, about meetings stacked one after the other, and I nodded as though I believed him. Inside, I was already planning. His performance relied on my silence, but I had discovered the power of observation. Every detail he let slip, every habit he repeated, could become a thread I would pull. Naomi continued her visits, playing her role with practiced ease. She poured wine, leaned across my counter with sympathetic eyes, and asked if I was feeling better. Sometimes she brushed my hair back the way she used to in college, as if she still had the right. One evening, she placed her hand on mine and said, "You're lucky to have Drew. He adores you." The word lucky landed like poison. I smiled faintly, refilled her glass, and tucked away the moment. Her audacity no longer surprised me. It fed the fire building inside. The more they underestimated me, the clearer my path became. At night, when Drew slept soundly beside me, I sat in the living room with the city glowing through the windows. I thought about every time they had twisted my doubts into evidence against me, every time they had used the word crazy to silence me. Those memories no longer cut the way they once had. They steadied me. They reminded me that revenge was not about shouting, it was about strategy. I told myself that silence, the very weapon they had used against me, would become mine. If they thought my quiet meant surrender, they would never see what I was building beneath it. It wasn't rage that guided me anymore. It was clarity. I began to notice how Drew left his laptop open just long enough for me to glimpse subject lines, how Naomi stumbled over a phrase and corrected herself too quickly. Every slip was a signal. Every lie they repeated was another brick in the case I would build. They had scripted me as unstable, but I was already rewriting the narrative. My mask was firmly in place: the loyal wife, the grateful friend, the daughter-in-law who smiled at dinners and never questioned the stories told around her. But beneath that mask, I was working quietly, methodically, shaping the weapon that would undo them both. The decision came to me, not in a burst, but as a steady truth, the kind that seeps into your bones until it feels like it was always there. I would not simply survive this. I would expose them. I would make sure every person who had believed their lies would see the truth with their own eyes and hear it in their own voices. My silence had protected them long enough. Soon it would be the silence after the crash that marked their downfall. What I didn't know then was how quickly opportunity would present itself. Their arrogance was boundless, and arrogance always leaves cracks. I was ready to slip into those cracks, ready to gather the proof that would turn whispers into weapons. And once I had what I needed, there would be no turning back. Revenge, I discovered, isn't born in an instant. It's crafted, assembled piece by piece, as carefully as any blueprint Drew reviewed in his office. I began with evidence because words alone would never be enough. Drew had already framed me as paranoid Naomi, as unstable, and their chorus had convinced others to see me through that lens. If I stood in a room and accused them, they would turn it against me with the same skill they had always used. But proof undeniable and permanent would silence their lies. One evening, while Drew showered, I slipped his phone from the nightstand. My hands were steady, my breathing measured. His passcode was arrogant in its simplicity, his own birthday. I scrolled through messages, finding exactly what I expected: late-night excuses gaps where conversations had been deleted, fragments that told half the story. What he didn't know was that his iCloud backup still held the rest. Later, while he slept, I synced his phone to my laptop, watching line after line of texts spill across the screen. Dozens of calls at strange hours, entire threads erased but not gone, and just enough from Naomi to confirm the truth. Last night. Our secret. Don't let her find out. Each one became a stitch in the net I was weaving. Still texts could be explained away, twisted into misunderstandings. What I needed was their voices unguarded and unmistakable. I bought a small recorder slim enough to hide in the lining of my purse, the kind that could vanish under papers or slip inside a drawer unnoticed. The first time I used it, Naomi was sitting on my sofa, glass of wine in hand, her laughter bright. When Drew stopped by half an hour later, I excused myself to the kitchen, leaving the recorder under a stack of magazines. Their words drifted into the hallway, low but clear. Naomi's voice. "She doesn't suspect a thing." Drew's laugh followed. "Even if she did, no one would believe her." I stood in the dark, fists pressed against the counter, forcing myself not to burst in. Later, listening back, my anger trembled into something steadier power. They had handed me a weapon wrapped in their own arrogance. I grew bolder after that. When Drew left his laptop open, I lingered long enough to memorize a hotel confirmation sent to his email. When Naomi excused herself to take a call in the hallway, I stepped closer, recording the hushed tones that confirmed what I already knew. Each time I added a new file to my collection, I felt control slide back into my hands like a long-denied blade. Screenshots of texts, receipts tucked into folders, audio labeled and dated with precision. I became a collector of their carelessness, cataloging every slip they believed went unseen. The danger was real, and I knew it. Once Drew handed me his phone to show me a news article, forgetting he had left a message thread open. Naomi's name glared up at me. My breath caught, but I smiled, handed it back, and asked if he wanted more coffee. He accepted it without hesitation, convinced my calm meant ignorance. Another time, Naomi slipped after too much wine, starting to say, when Drew and I before quickly correcting herself. My heart raced, but I laughed, teasing her about her storytelling, while the recorder in my purse quietly captured the truth. Each close call reminded me I was walking a razor's edge, but instead of frightening me, it steeled me further. They mistook my composure for blindness, and that mistake would ruin them. Weeks turned into months, and the folder of evidence on my hidden drive thickened. I began spreading everything across my desk late at night, the Chicago skyline glowing beyond the window. Text receipts, recordings, photographs of Naomi brushing Drew's sleeve at dinners when she thought no one noticed. Arranged together, they formed the story exactly as it was, not as they had told it. Their version, Elise the paranoid wife, dissolved under the weight of their own voices and signatures. My silence had finally paid its price. What surprised me most was how calm I became. There was no frantic rush, no desperate need to confront them before I was ready. I smiled when Evelyn praised Naomi at dinner, nodded when Richard spoke proudly of Drew, and let Claire chatter about her children while I passed the salad. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, I was a strategist biding her time. Each event became another rehearsal, another moment where I practiced wearing the mask that would make my eventual strike all the more devastating. Naomi noticed nothing. She still came by with bottles of wine, still tilted her head with mock concern, and asked if I was doing better. Drew remained confident, convinced his charm and rehearsed sincerity could carry him forever. They believed they had written me into a corner, that I would either crumble or disappear. What they didn't realize was that I had already begun dismantling their world brick by brick, and by the time they noticed, nothing would remain standing. One night, I sat at my desk, staring at the spread of evidence, and realized the plan was no longer forming. It was ready. The texts, the receipts, the recordings, each one was a nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. All that remained was execution. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights glittering like witnesses, and felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Not because the pain was gone, but because I knew it would no longer be mine to carry alone. Soon, they would carry it for me. And as I closed the folders and slipped the recorder back into its drawer, I knew the time for silence was nearly over. What waited ahead wasn't improvisation. It was a design complete and unshakable, and I was ready to put it into motion. The night of the dinner, I felt as though I were walking into a stage I had built myself. Evelyn's table glittered with crystal candles flickered against polished silver, and laughter swelled through the grand dining room as if nothing dark could live beneath the surface. I wore a simple black dress, pearls resting at my collarbone, and kept my movements deliberate. No one suspected that beneath the tablecloth in my palm rested the remote that controlled the small speakers hidden in the corners of the room. They thought I was just another ornament at that table, quiet and composed. Only I knew what was about to happen. Drew tapped his knife gently against his glass, summoning the attention he always craved. He raised his wine, his smile perfectly rehearsed. To family, he said, his voice rich with charm. To loyalty and trust, the ties that hold us together. Around the table, glasses lifted, and Naomi's eyes caught mine. She smiled, confident, as if daring me to break. I raised my glass as well, letting my lips curl into the faintest smile. Yes, I said softly. To loyalty, to trust, and to truth. A flicker crossed Drew's face, but he brushed it aside with another grin, unaware that those words were his warning. The moment I pressed the button, the room shifted. At first, it was only a crackle enough to draw curious glances. Then Drew's voice filled the space, unmistakable. I can't stop thinking about last night. Naomi's reply followed, breathless and damning. You'll have to. People are starting to notice. A hush spread like smoke. Forks hovered midair, glasses paused halfway to lips, eyes darting from one face to another. Then came Drew's laugh, recorded and careless. Let them. She'll never believe it. His mask cracked as his jaw tightened, his eyes wide with disbelief. Naomi's hand flew to her mouth, color draining from her face. This is some kind of trick? Drew stammered, his voice rising. She's edited this. But before he could spin further, Naomi's recorded words cut him off. You know she's starting to sound crazy. Keep feeding that. The more unstable she looks, the safer we are. Gasps broke around the table. Evelyn's hand clutched at her pearls. Richard's face hardened into stone, and Claire shook her head in shock. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my breathing steady. I didn't need to say anything. Their own voices had done the work for me. Drew rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my clutch and pulled out the neat stack of papers I had prepared. Receipts, transcripts, photographs, all printed and organized. I spread them across the polished wood like cards in a game he had already lost. Here are the dates, I said evenly. The hotel confirmations, the texts, the conversations you thought were deleted. Every piece of proof while you told me I was losing my mind. Naomi pushed her chair back, panic rising in her voice. Elise, please, I cut her off with a glance sharper than any blade. Don't call me like you still have the right to. The silence that followed was brutal. Drew's mother looked at me, not with pity, but with horror, at the son she thought she knew. Richard's voice finally broke through low and final. Is this true? He asked. Drew opened his mouth, but no words came. Naomi stuttered, but the evidence lay spread before them. Their own voices still echoed in the air. There was no escape. I slid one last envelope across the table to Richard. I've already filed for divorce, I said calmly, and I've included full disclosure of his infidelity. I know how much your company prides itself on its family values. Imagine what happens when this goes public. Richard scanned the documents, his face darkening with fury. When he finally looked at Drew, his voice cut like steel. You've disgraced this family. You're finished. Evelyn turned her face away, unable to meet her son's eyes. Claire muttered that she was ashamed, her voice trembling with anger. Drew tried again. Desperate, Elise, we can talk about this privately. I shook my head. No. You humiliated me publicly. You told everyone I was unstable. So this stays public. Naomi's tears streaked her face, mascara bleeding into the silk of her dress. Drew's fists clenched at his sides, his composure shattered, but neither of them had an answer. Their lies lay in pieces before the only audience that mattered to them. I rose slowly, smoothing my dress, and gathered my clutch. Drew's voice broke as he reached toward me. Elise, please. I didn't look at him. I stepped toward the door, pausing only once to glance back. You wanted me to look crazy, I said, my voice steady. Now look at yourself. And then I left my heels striking against the marble floor, leaving their empire of lies collapsing behind me. The weight I carried out of that house wasn't the same as the one I had carried in. It wasn't grief or humiliation anymore. It was the quiet satisfaction of truth finally breaking free. Their masks had shattered in the very place they had felt most secure, and nothing could repair it. Yet I knew this was only the beginning. Exposing them was one thing. Watching their carefully built lives unravel in the weeks that followed would be something else entirely. And as I stepped into the cool night air, the voices of their betrayal still echoing in the dining room behind me, I knew their downfall had only just begun. The aftermath of that dinner swept through the Whitman family like a storm no one had prepared for. The house that once radiated confidence and order now echoed with silence. Richard stopped taking Drew's calls, his anger plain in the clipped messages he returned through an assistant. Evelyn, who had always softened her son's failures, refused to see him at all. Even Claire, whose loyalty had rarely wavered, sent back the gifts Drew pressed into her hands, her voice flat, when she told him she couldn't look her sister-in-law in the eyes after what he had done. For the first time in his life, Drew stood outside the circle of a family that had always gathered to protect him. At work, the shift came quickly. Whitman and Cole had long traded on the image of being a family firm built on integrity, and Richard guarded that reputation more than any ledger. Within days of the dinner, Drew was cut from project meetings, his name omitted from announcements that once carried his signature. His office door, once a revolving entry for staff and partners, stayed closed. I heard through acquaintances that he had been quietly reassigned a polite word for exile. For a man who thrived on being admired, the sudden distance was a punishment sharper than any raised voice. Naomi fared no better. Whispers spread through her professional circles with astonishing speed. Clients who once boasted about her flair withdrew their contracts, unwilling to risk association. Invitations to events dried up, replaced by silence or worse, pointed exclusions. The woman who had built her life on being envied was suddenly left standing alone. I watched from a distance as her polished world unraveled, the perfect photos she curated giving way to gaps, then to nothing at all. She had fed on attention, but without it, she faded quickly into someone unrecognizable. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, more swiftly than I had ever imagined. My folder of evidence spoke for me, texts, recordings, receipts, stacked neatly into a timeline that left no room for doubt. Drew sat across from me in the courtroom, shoulders slumped, his once proud eyes dulled by fatigue. Each time the judge reviewed a piece of proof, his face seemed to shrink further, as if the weight of his own words pressed him into the chair. The court granted me the condo, a share of assets, and the freedom to carry my name unblemished. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. His downfall was written in his own hand and spoken in his own voice. In the weeks after the judgment, I saw Drew only in glimpses. Once at a cafe in Lincoln Park, I caught sight of him through the window. His suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans and a shirt that looked slept in. He stood outside a building with Richard voices raised. Even from a distance, I could hear the words that cut. "You are no son of mine," Richard said, loud enough that the staff inside turned their heads. Drew's eyes darted, searching for dignity where there was none left. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. He looked as if he might come inside, might reach for me with whatever was left of his pride, but instead, he turned and walked into the crowd, his shoulders hunched, his figure diminished. Naomi's final unraveling came not in whispers, but in headlines. A drunk driving arrest, her mugshot plastered across local sites, the story repeated in papers that once praised her flair for reinvention. No one rushed to her defense. No family posted bail, no friends appeared by her side. She stood alone in that photo, stripped of the shine she had so carefully worn for years. For a woman who once reveled in control, the collapse was public and merciless, and I felt no pity. She had chosen her path, and this was where it led. Through it all, I moved quietly, not flaunting victories, not seeking attention. I continued my work at school, spoke with students about resilience, and returned each evening to a home that finally felt like mine again. Freedom didn't come with loud celebration. It came with peace, the kind that settles over you when the lies are gone and the weight you carried is no longer yours. Yet I knew this chapter wasn't finished. I had given the family, the court, and the world just enough to dismantle their lives. What remained hidden, tucked away in a deposit box only I could access, was more than enough to bury them 100 times over. And if either of them ever tried to crawl back into power, if they ever dared to speak my name with contempt again, I knew exactly what I would do. I would press play all over again. The thought no longer came with rage, but with calm certainty. Their destruction was not a single act. It was a shadow that would follow them, a reminder that truth cannot be erased. Still, even with their ruin unfolding in public, I carried myself carefully. Dignity was all I had ever wanted back, and now that it was mine, I would not let it slip away. Yet late at night, when I closed my eyes, I knew there was one last step left for me. Justice had been served, but closure is something different. To find it, I would have to face not only what they had done, but who I had become because of it. And that reckoning was still waiting. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a different rhythm. The anger that once pulsed beneath my skin no longer controlled me. I had seen Drew stripped of the power he had worn like armor, and I had watched Naomi unravel in public, her polish gone, her reputation in tatters. Their punishment hadn't come from my hands alone, it had come from the truth, and the truth carried its own kind of justice. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. Not because I had forgotten, but because I no longer carried it alone. The condo felt new, though it hadn't changed. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows in the morning, and the air no longer seemed heavy with secrets. I filled the space with fresh flowers, with music that reminded me who I was before doubt crept in, and with the quiet company of friends who had always believed in me. The silence I had once dreaded now felt different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of peace. Drew tried once months later to reach out. A letter arrived with his handwriting across the envelope, and for a long moment I held it in my hands, unsure if I wanted to open it. Inside was a simple request for forgiveness, words written by a man who finally understood loss. I burned the letter in the sink, watching the paper curl into ash. Forgiveness, I decided, wasn't mine to give. My peace didn't depend on him, it depended on me. Naomi faded from my life without a word. There was no confrontation, no attempt at apology, just a quiet absence where she had once been. And I preferred it that way. The woman I had once called a sister no longer existed in my world. In time, I stopped looking for her name in the papers or her face on the street. She was simply gone, and with her absence came space for something new, space for myself. What I learned through it all was simple, though it came at a cost. People can strip you of many things, your trust, your reputation, even your voice. But dignity is something you can reclaim piece by piece if you refuse to let go of it. I had been called paranoid, dismissed as unstable, and silenced until I almost believed their lies. But the truth has a way of surviving even in the dark, and when it finally comes into the light, it is stronger than any deception. Now, when I stand in front of my students and talk about resilience, I understand it in a way I never did before. Resilience is not pretending you were never hurt. It is learning to carry yourself with grace even when the world tries to break you. It is choosing to rebuild even when you never asked to be torn down. My life is quieter now, but in that quiet, I have found strength. And that strength is mine alone. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more stories of truth and resilience, stay connected here.